Solar Eclipse. The Rise and Fall of the Solar Lodge. The book Inside Solar Lodge, Outside the Law, True Tale of Initiation and High Adventure by Frater Shiva reveals in enthralling specifics the inner workings of the Solar Lodge, how they came to be formed, their peak years of activity, and their dissolution. This publication fills many unanswered questions concerning how a renegade occult group came to both prominence and infamy. Until now, many readers first became exposed to the Solar Lodge through highly biased and speculative publications, most specifically in the early editions of the book The Family by Ed Sanders, a member of the 60s group The Fugs. This book inferred a connection between the Manson family and the Solar Lodge, and insinuated that lodge members engaged in animal sacrifice and child abuse amongst other types of depravities. Sanders also speculated that they engaged in black magic practices to generate hate vibes, meant to increase racial disharmony and push things beyond the boiling point within the Watts neighborhood. After realizing his drastic misrepresentation of the group's activities, Sanders withdrew the chapter dealing with the Solar Lodge and subsequent printings of his book. But the stigma of guilt by association had already damaged the public image of the lodge in a way that would prove nearly impossible to undo. It is precisely this lingering distortion that prompted Frater Shiva to make his account public. According to Shiva, the true tale of initiation and high adventure had existed in private manuscript form since 1970, circulating only among a small number of individuals. It was not until 2007, after encountering his name online attached to what he described as the tale of perverted horror, that he chose to release an abbreviated version publicly. This act, more corrective than confessional, ultimately led to the book's publication. There was, as he emphasizes, no grand timing or agenda, only a desire to dispel illusion and set the record straight. Frater Shiva became involved with the Solar Lodge from its infancy and quickly became a highly trusted, key member within the group. He eventually managed a Solar Lodge magical metaphysical bookstore called the Eye of Horus. His deep involvement within the group from the beginning puts him in a rare position to be able to provide a historic account of the many trials and tribulations which the Solar Lodge had to endure. More importantly, his perspective is neither purely defensive nor accusatory. He neither fully legitimizes nor entirely dismisses the lodge, instead presenting it as a complex evolving experiment in applied occultism. The group began with the initiation of Jean Brayton by a member of the defunct Agape Lodge named Ray Burlingame, Frater Aquarius. Agape Lodge was a chapter within Aleister Crowley's Ordo Templi Orientis. Brayton's initiation was controversial since Burlingame had no official authority to initiate new candidates. Shiva addresses this issue directly and without embellishment. Burlingame initiated Jean Brayton, then instructed her to initiate others, including Shiva himself, before his death in 1965. This simple chain of events created a lineage that was from the outset ambiguous. There was no living authority to validate the act, no formal recognition from an existing governing body. Shortly after the initiation of both Brayton and her husband Richard, Frater Aquarius died, and soon after Jean decided to establish an initiatory order and named it the Solar Lodge. At the time there were no other apparent active OTO groups that Brayton was aware of, so the advent of the Solar Lodge was engaging in its attempt to re-establish a magical link with Crowley's order. However, Shiva later reflected on this with notable clarity. Simply being the only active group does not automatically confer legitimacy. The OTO, as he explains, is a temporal organization with strict rules governing succession and authorization. By those standards, Solar Lodge could not claim official recognition. Yet, paradoxically, the absence of competing lineages at the time allowed it to function as though it were legitimate. This tension between formal legitimacy and practical operation would remain central to the lodge's identity. The Braytons invested in real estate. Many of her students were tenants in apartments that she owned, and eventually added a 3-story mansion to their acquisitions, which also included 2 bookstores, various apartments, and a Thelemic service station. The Solar Lodge quickly grew and expanded within its first few years, attracting many spiritually seeking individuals within the Southern California area. Gene Brayton established a reading list for students, and initiations were performed for the grades of probationer and neophyte. Brayton emphasized the importance of banishings and set the lesser ritual of the pentagram and the invocation of Thoth at the core of the magical curriculum. In addition, liberation and adoration of the sun was performed 4 times a day by students. What makes this structure particularly interesting is how it blended 2 distinct systems. According to Shiva, Solar Lodge operated as a combination of both the OTO and the AA, while the ritual framework and initiatory ceremonies were derived from OTO material. Advancement depended heavily on the individual work associated with the AA curriculum. In practice, this meant that members were expected to complete specific spiritual tasks, meditation, study, and ritual discipline before progressing. One could not simply be advanced ceremonially. There was an expectation of internal development. Shiva notes that there was never a formal initiation into the AA as such. Instead, individuals effectively initiated themselves by taking oaths and performing the required work. This reflects a fundamental philosophical distinction. While the OTO emphasizes structure and transmission, the AA emphasizes attainment. The Solar Lodge did not emerge in a vacuum. Members were aware of the historical significance of Agape Lodge and its connection to Aleister Crowley, and they considered themselves, in some sense, to be building upon its legacy. Shiva confirms that the group was familiar with the history of Agape Lodge, though direct teachings from that lineage were minimal. Frater Aquarius spoke little about his occult history, aside from occasional remarks, including a cryptic observation that a lot of people die as the result of an initiation. The lodge's intellectual environment was shaped largely by available texts, which were surprisingly scarce at the time. Crowley's works were not widely accessible, and many had to be sourced individually. The Eye of Horus bookstore played a key role in distributing what materials could be obtained, including works by Blavatsky, Manly P. Hall, and texts on yoga and astral projection. This scarcity fostered a culture of self-reliance. Members were not simply consuming doctrine, they were actively reconstructing a system from limited resources, combining study with direct practice. By 1969, the Solar Lodge faced harassment by conservative community members and sought out a retreat. Through the resourcefulness of devoted members, they quickly established a group of Quonset huts in a remote desert area north of Blythe, California. Contrary to later assumptions, this move was not driven by an apocalyptic mindset. Shiva explicitly rejects that interpretation, stating that most members were simply following ritual directives and enjoying the experience. The desert environment aligned with Thelemic practices that emphasized ritual under open skies. However, the shift to a permanent desert settlement had unintended consequences. What had once been a relatively invisible group became highly visible to nearby rural communities. This visibility invited scrutiny, suspicion, and eventually hostility. It wasn't long before troubles befell the group in spite of their isolation. A difficult, troubled child of one of the group members started a large fire and burned much of the group's belongings, including a rare magical book collection and other relics. In an attempt to discipline and confine the child until his father arrived, he was locked within a small storage shed. According to Shiva's account, the intention was preventative rather than punitive to stop further destruction. However, the situation escalated rapidly when a discontent member leaked this information to authorities. The incident soon became sensationalized in the press as the boy in the box, transforming a contained internal matter into a public scandal. Context was stripped away, and the narrative was reframed in the most alarming terms possible. This marked a critical turning point. Warrants were issued for some members, and the Braytons fled to Mexico to avoid prosecution. The Solar Lodge, already under suspicion, now found itself firmly in the crosshairs of law enforcement and media attention. It was at this juncture that the OTO was reactivated by Grady McMurtry in Berkeley. The Caliphate OTO did not recognize the legitimacy of the Solar Lodge and added further scrutiny to the group. Simultaneously, the cultural climate of the late 1960s amplified fears surrounding occult groups. The Manson family murders had created a widespread association between alternative spiritual movements and violence. In this environment, Ed Sanders' claims gained traction. Shiva acknowledges that timing played a role, but also suggests that misinformation was deliberately provided by certain individuals. Even after Sanders retracted his statements, the damage remained. The Solar Lodge became, in the public imagination, a symbol of everything feared about secret societies. The group was never again able to regain the popularity which it achieved in its early years. Although they continued for several years, they developed into an authoritarian structure referred to by Shiva as the Tong. This shift marked a departure from the lodge's original spirit. What had once been a dynamic, exploratory environment became increasingly rigid and controlled. Shiva himself had already distanced from the group by this stage, and his retrospective assessment suggests that the transformation was both internal and inevitable. He points to earlier compromises such as initiating individuals who had not met required standards as signs that the lodge had begun to deviate from its foundational principles well before its public collapse. One of Shiva's most intriguing contributions is his explanation of what he calls blowing up the ashram. According to this concept, spiritual groups that reach a certain level of development are sometimes subjected to a sudden and disruptive force. This cosmic intervention breaks apart the structure, forcing members to either evolve or disperse. He likens this process to the archetype of the blasted tower, a sudden influx of energy that destroys existing harmony in order to facilitate transformation. From this perspective, the downfall of the Solar Lodge was not merely a failure, but part of a larger initiatory process. The fire, the scandals, the internal conflicts all can be seen as manifestations of this disruptive force. Whether one accepts this interpretation or not, it offers a compelling framework through which to understand the lodge's trajectory. Following the decline of the Solar Lodge, Shiva continued his work independently. He later helped develop the Sirius star system, a structure that retained elements of the AA practice while eliminating centralized authority. This new system emphasized self-initiation, minimal hierarchy, and individual responsibility. There were no formal examinations or rigid organizational structures, only the work itself. This evolution reflects a broader lesson drawn from the Solar Lodge experience, that spiritual systems may survive even when the organizations that house them collapse. Through Shiva's account, a more nuanced picture emerges, one that challenges simplistic portrayals and invites deeper reflection. The lodge was neither purely innocent nor entirely corrupt. It was a human institution, shaped by the same forces that influence any collective endeavor: ambition, belief, error, and change. In the end, perhaps the most enduring insight comes from Shiva's own interpretation of Thelema, that the true work lies not in organizations or structures, but in the individual pursuit of purpose and understanding. The Solar Lodge may have dissolved, but the magical currents it explored remain very much alive.